Hello, everyone. Welcome and good evening. I'm Noam Shapiro. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the Programs Associate at Interfaith Power and Light DMV. It is such a pleasure to join with you all this evening as we look towards the spring, even as a cold front comes across much of the country. And we gather together to learn how we can begin planting native plant gardens and combating invasive species in our communities. We often talk at Interfaith Power and Light about structural change that we can make and also changes that we can make in our own communities. And so it's really a thrill to focus internally into what we can do in our own gardens, in our own synagogues, in our own backyards, and then broadly in the DMV community tonight. As we think about our relationship to the land that we live and pray on, that we work on, that we sleep on, that we walk on, I'd like to open with a brief land acknowledgement. While land acknowledgements alone are not enough, we at Interfaith Power and Light DMV think they're an important social justice practice that promotes Indigenous visibility. We acknowledge that Washington, D.C. and the surrounding areas of Maryland and Northern Virginia are the traditional territory of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway peoples who have served as stewards of the region for generations. Their presence is imbued in the lands and waters and plants surrounding all of us. We feel their presence every day. May we nurture our relationship with our Indigenous neighbors and the shared responsibilities to their homelands where we all reside today. And in addition to that, I just would like to pull out a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who some of you might know from her landmark book, Braiding Sweet Grass. In Emergence magazine, she writes, Indigenous languages, lifeways, and relations with the land have all been subjected to the violence of colonialism. But, she writes, there is a kernel of resurgence if we are willing to take the time to learn. The invitation to decolonize, to rematriate, and renew the honorable harvest extends beyond Indigenous nations to everyone who eats. She's speaking specifically about the land that we farm, the food that we eat, but I think that speaks more broadly to the way that we can transform the immaculate lawns that we've had as a part of our culture for so long and return them to a more Indigenous, native, natural state. So as we begin the Jewish month of Adar, a month of joy and defiance, and to borrow Kimmerer's language, resurgence, I'd like to invite you all to just take a moment to answer in the chat the following question, which is, what is one climate action that you're taking this spring that's bringing you joy or nourishment? What's something that you're doing in your community, or maybe something that you're looking forward to doing that makes you feel full of joy and nourishment? I'll put that in the chat too. I'm seeing planting trees, de-lawning, and lots of gardening. Adding more native plants to our home landscape, renovating the temple, storm water prevention, that's great. Fantastic. Feel free to keep on adding those responses to the chat and really engaging with the chat tonight. I know there are lots of people on the call who have lots of questions and experiences that they want to share, so I please invite you to engage. Tonight, we're going to hear from several leaders from the Jewish environmental and sustainability communities in the DMV who are really deeply involved in the process of rematriating, of returning to its maternal source, the land we live and worship on. We'll share some practical information and guidance on how to begin this work yourselves, and also open the floor to questions and to reflections from our broader community. We're going to start tonight with an opening drosh from Joelle Novi, my colleague, the director of Interfaith Power and Light DMV, and she's going to contextualize our work in our wonderful Jewish tradition. Next, we'll hear from Linda Solomon of Oseh Shalom in Laurel, Maryland, who will teach us about her community's incredible participation in the Sacred Grounds Project facilitated by the National Wildlife Federation. Then we'll learn how Montgomery County Master Gardener, Betsy Kingery of Temple Shalom in Silver Spring, empowers homeowners to take environmental action 1 yard at a time. And lastly, we'll hear from Nancy and Stuart Davis of Beth El Hebrew congregation about how their congregation has removed invasives from their 2-acre hickory wood forest over the past decade. It's a really incredible project. And so I'm really grateful that they're with us tonight. We'll also open up the floor to a few other green leaders from Temple Sinai who will share some reflections with us as well. Again, we'll take questions throughout the evening, so feel free to write in the chat, and Joel and I will be monitoring it. So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Joel to just share an opening drosh with us.
Thanks, everybody. So I want to look at briefly at the story of the strangers who appeared at Abraham and Sarah's tent, which has become the kind of paradigmatic Jewish story about hospitality and what it means to be a good host. So, Avram is, recovering from a procedure and a little uncomfortable and sitting under the trees. And he looks up at the hottest part of the day and sees three strangers approaching. This is Parshat Vayera in Bereshit. And he stops what he's doing, runs towards them, bows down, greets them, asks if he can host them, suggests that somebody go get water, offers to bathe their feet and help them recline, getting bread and a good meal for them. He ran in and got other people involved. He asked Sarah and others to help prepare a meal. And this is, this has become the go-to text for thinking about how to be hospitable to guests in our homes and guests in our congregations, about, thinking about what would make those who enter our spaces comfortable. But for me, it's become a really helpful teaching for thinking about expanding our idea of hospitality beyond our species and thinking about what it would be like to welcome guests of other species into the places that we live, whether it's our yards or our congregation land. And that some of that same wisdom that we see in that Torah story apply here too, that we need to put aside our own perspective and run out proactively to welcome other species into our space. We need to think in advance about what they like to eat and whether they'll have water and shade and comfort and what that means for them from their perspective. What are some of the plants and what are some of the things that should be present for all kinds of creatures and the whole food chain of plants and animals to feel welcomed in our spaces. And that we can't wait until they're asking us or they've been driven out of that space. We have to rush to offer that hospitality, and we have to get our other people involved in that progress, work together. And I want to remind all of us that this story ends with this very auspicious blessing where these three guests who Abraham welcomed so enthusiastically, even though he didn't know them and know anything about them, and didn't, set aside his own concerns to prioritize their needs and their welcome. They deliver this news that Sarah and Abraham will be able to welcome a son, even though they're so old, and they end up bringing a blessing and bringing good news. And I think so it is with us, that if we can, when our Jewish communities and when all of the faith communities we're working with are able to extend their spirit of hospitality beyond our species and really think in an interconnected way about the entire ecosystem in which we exist, that actually the blessing ultimately redounds back to us. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Joelle, for sharing that teaching with us. The idea of kind of rushing out to meet fellow species, to meet the natural world is so beautiful. And when I think about that image and I think about a community that is really running out to meet this challenge, I think about Oseh Shalom and their partnership with the National Wildlife Federation and the Sacred Grounds Project. So it's now my absolute pleasure to welcome Linda to share some of her reflections on this amazing work you're doing.
Well, good evening. I actually thought I would share some pictures so that I can talk and you can see some pretty pictures as I talk. So we're in our second year. Oseh Shalom is in its second year of this Sacred Grounds program. And when I first heard Sacred Grounds, my first reaction was somewhere special. You know, it's sacred. Does that mean, you know, there's a special place that we would take care of? And actually, I've come to learn that the sacred part means we should care for all creation as though it's sacred, as though it's special, as though it needs that kind of attention. So we've learned a lot in this last year. The Sacred Grounds program has 15 other congregations as part of the program. 3 of them are in Laurel. There are churches and mosques and of course synagogues. And there are some in DC and some in Montgomery County as well. Here's just a couple pictures of the group of us in Laurel. There's three congregations: a Catholic church, the synagogue, and a mosque. We're working together. There are sponsors supporting the Sacred Grounds program. Interfaith Power and Light is one of them, because of the importance of the work. So the goals of Sacred Grounds is to beautify our grounds in a sustainable way, which helps our wildlife and helps our waterways. It may mitigate our climate change. It will definitely clean our waterways and create wildlife habitat. And in so doing, giving up some of our grassy lawn will save money and time. So I'll zoom ahead here to some other pictures. So thank you for bearing with me here. I've always had a passion personally for waterways. I don't know what it is. Maybe there's something calming for me to be on the water. And so when I learned through Sacred Grounds that native plants would hold the water and filter the water, keeping our waterways cleaner, I was sold. I wanted to learn more about native plants and what it means and how I can help spread the good words. Here's the Anacostia River, which is now clean. It used to be called one of the 30 dirtiest rivers in the US, and through the effort of many people, it is now a clean waterway. And the blue heron, as we all know, the wildlife relies on fish and other things that we provide them with native plants to survive. And of course, so do we, our recreation, as well as eating some of the good fish that maybe we catch. So we zoom ahead here to another beautiful pictures of native plants that we could put in our yard. And of course, butterflies being attracted to many native plants. One of the things I've learned through the Sacred Grounds program is that there are over 150 native bees in Maryland, just in Maryland. And these bees come in all sizes and colors. And the green one that you see here, this is over 400 species of bees, is the most common. I'm sorry, I don't remember its name. And the native bees don't sting. It is honeybees that have come from Europe that will sting if they feel threatened. So here's a close-up of that one. Okay. So part of the program with Sacred Grounds is to educate and to encourage people to plant native plants. Along the way, we decided as a group that we needed a web page to start collecting information. The QR code would take you to our web page. We have on there an explanation of what is Sacred Grounds. We encourage people to pledge to plant native, and I'll explain what that means. We show events coming up And we have links to resources. How do you get started? What are native plants? What do plant gardens look like? And there are templates out there. Howard County has the Bee City template. Montgomery County has Rainscapes template. And there are others out there that will help you design a garden, whether you're sunny, shady, or part shade, on a slope or not. And so we wanted to gather that information somewhere where people can start to explore that. So we created a web page that would present that information. And here are just examples of homes with a front yard and a backyard with native plants. Of course, they're beautiful. No reason why they wouldn't, and they support the wildlife. So it's not a lack of beauty that we're looking at, thinking they're more beautiful. It's more that they can be beautiful and they support the native wildlife. And here's an example of someone who gave up their grass along a walkway and planted native plants. The National Wildlife Federation has a program to certify your home as a wildlife habitat if you meet some criteria. It's on their webpage. And there was a study conducted recently which showed that those homes, and they studied the certified wildlife habitat homes versus the average, the typical home, has more diversity. And when you think about it, it makes sense. They studied 6 different cities across the US. And when you think about it, those 6 different cities have different native plants. If all of these certified wildlife habitat homes are planting native, they're attracting native species. And so the total diversity for across all these homes is going to be more. So that was an interesting exercise to learn about. And let's see, let's move ahead. And here we have a picture that the National Wildlife Federation helped us design and bought the plants and compost for putting in a native plant garden at our synagogue, Oseh Shalom. And you see pictures here of volunteers that came together to actually plant. And we included our teenagers in the effort. And some more pictures, we're tilling the ground on the left, and the plants that we put in on the right, we planted 160 plants. That's only half our garden you're seeing in both of those pictures. So part of the encouragement is to get people to plant native, because we want them to get started. We want them to start being conscious about native plants and choosing them. And these are some pictures from our native plant pickup day. Our goal last year was 40 households, and we were nervous about getting people to commit. And we were blown away that we had 55 households commit to planting native. So it was a very festive day. Who doesn't like to get some plants, come by and get plants and talk about nature and just talk. These are the pictures from that. And this year, our goal is 55 households. So we're working very hard to get people to once again commit. Here are some comments from our congregants. They learned a lot. Some of the plants did well, some didn't. They were inspired to create new garden spaces. So it's making a difference, and we can be quite proud of that. So we do have a pledge. It's not limited to our congregation. If you're interested in receiving some small native plants, you can pledge. That's a QR code, take you right to our pledge, and then come May 7th and pick up your plants and say hi. And there are other events going on. You can find these on our website. Here's even this week, the National Wildlife Federation is sponsoring a webinar. There's 2 different ones. You could go to one or the other. You don't have to go to both, to talk about how to create a native plant garden. And then, as I mentioned, our pickup day. So when I first got started, I was like, sacred grounds, what does that mean? But it's so important when we when you finally understand the depth of how much our suburbia looks the same clear across the whole United States, grass, some bushes in front of our homes and a couple of trees, and how that is so different from what it used to be and doesn't support the native wildlife. And the fact that we're a chain of supporting each other, then getting the message out just resonated with me. And I hope along the way we're helping other people to see that too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. So I'm curious, what about this was difficult? Were there any moments when you felt like you had to really teach folks in your congregation something new, or change their thinking about something, or invite them to change their thinking about something?
Well, so the National Wildlife Federation provided a tremendous amount of support. The first year they had a focus group meetings with a small number of people to actually gauge what the congregation knew and what interests them. And using that information, it helped guide how we were to approach them. Then we had this Why Plant Native, and we just had another one this yesterday. We have a Why Plant Native presentation, and you reach out to people and you try to get them to attend. The pledge, I think, is a nice incentive that they get plants. So what's challenging is really getting people's attention. We're pulled in so many directions. We can put out lots of advertisement, but the best way to reach people is by word of mouth. Go to a group, talk to a small group of people and let them know. And they're like, oh, I didn't know about that. And for months you've put the information out there, but people are drawn in so many directions that sometimes it's that direct conversation that says, hey, that is something that interests me.
I do feel that so much of this work so much of the work of just transforming our lives and our society in the climate crisis is asking us to reimagine what we find beautiful and what we find delicious, right? And maybe, not treating those things as immutable, but saying well, maybe our idea of what is a beautiful lawn, needs to change. And we, by understanding more deeply, we can come to see something different as beautiful. And you mentioned,
I'm sure. I think you're right. I think we do have a sense, and letting people see alternatives, especially with the native plants. The National Wildlife Federation posted this webinar that was given a year ago that talked about this 4-year study that I mentioned. And they said, well, what are the stumbling blocks? And the stumbling blocks, again, are people have a lot going on. How do you reach them? And sometimes you reach them by making it clear that once you put out the effort to establish that native plant garden, and if you picked up some of that lawn to do it, you have less pesticides, so you have less phosphorus running off into your waterways. You have less time spent mowing. You have less pollution from your gas lawnmower going up in the air. That those things might grab their attention, and then the beauty of the native plants would take over, and the less maintenance once they're established. So yeah, I think grabbing attention is the important piece.
I'm going to raise up a couple things that have come up in the chat. One is, and I'm going to invite everyone to share their ideas in the chat rather than just in this moment, but is, in specifically Jewish communities, are there ways to mark specific holidays or to use the plants, native plants for in particular ritual ways? Somebody mentioned fragrant plants for Havdalah, spices and things like that. And there were some great responses already in the chat. So I invite folks to share ideas for incorporating this work into the life of your community. I've thought a lot about how, for I grew up in a generation where for Tu B'Shvat, you planted parsley in like a little styrofoam cup, like literally in a styrofoam cup. And then it was like theoretically on the Passover Seder plate, but there was like really no connection to the like ecological context of any of that, nor was there awareness about the styrofoam cup. So like what is an earth-based ritual tie-in look like? And the other point that was made in the chat, and we'll talk about this tonight because folks have come at this different ways, is about the balance between saying yes to native plants and just celebrating them as beautiful and wonderful versus really discouraging folks from distributing or planting invasives and becoming more aware of them and taking them down. And we can talk more about the balance, finding the balance of saying yes and no, and like how to educate folks about those simultaneously. I think I'll wrap up with my part with just an invitation to share what your favorite memory has been from this journey with your shul so far.
My favorite memory. I think I've enjoyed the process of creating the garden. This year, National Wildlife Federation wanted us lay leaders to lead the talk on why plant native. We did have a biologist, Francis Mullen, join us for part, and he spoke about part of it, but having to do that encouraged us, motivated us to spend more time learning so that we felt comfortable talking. And so that was amazing too. I've made changes in my own home because of it. There's a lot. There was something I was going to say in response. Oh, so Tu B'Shvat this year, our congregation joined with CJC in Colombia and out of Israel in Brockville. And they had a Tu B'Shvat Seder, and it included talking about native plants. So the National Wildlife Federation, Naomi Edelson was there, as well as one of my congregants was there as well, talking about it. This is the second year that our Sacred Grounds team is supporting Good Deeds Day. And we have sessions for the religious school, both parents and children, to talk about native plants and get them to plant. This year, we're going to have plant seeds so that we can grow 3 different types of native plants so we can have additional plants for the giveaway day. So I don't know. Those are all good memories.
That's great. One final question that came in while you were speaking was about whether there was any difficulty getting board or like the shul leadership buy-in to this project.
Actually, the original encouragement came from our rabbi. And that's when I was like, Sacred Grounds, what is that? What kind of name is that? So I think there was a lot of buy-in already. There were people interested in native plants or just improving our environment and exploring this. So there was one woman who was willing to lead it, and I said, I'd like a co-chair. And so I spoke up and said, I'd be willing to co-chair. So here we are.
Thank you, Linda, so much for all of the resources that you shared, for the perspective that you brought in, and for really telling us about the journey that you've gone on and that you've gone on with your whole community to really embrace the planting of native plants. Someone asked, is this a question of preaching to the choir, or do we all know that native plants are good or not? And I would say, just as in our tradition, we have in the Passover Seder, the 4 children, and we have to engage with members of our community in the way that we engage with the 4 children. We're not all starting out in the same place, and we all have different definitions of beauty, different definitions of environmental action, and so it's wonderful to bring all those perspectives together, even if some of us are master gardeners, as we're about to hear from one of them, and some of us are junior varsity gardeners. We need to learn from each other, and that's why these kinds of spaces are so exciting. So you mentioned that you had a lot of support from the National Wildlife Federation, and of course that's a specific program that is available to some congregations, but a lot of people might want to engage in this work and not necessarily know how to start, and maybe don't have the support of the National Wildlife Federation. So I'd love to turn it over to Betsy Kingery, who will share some of her personal reflections on how to bring this kind of work into our own homes, into our communities, whether we're supported by a partner organization or we're just doing it ourselves.
Well, I am in awe, Linda. You are an official master gardener, or a great job. I love the work that you're doing. I am going to share my screen, if I may. Oh. Okay. Well. Give me a minute. I am not all that savvy with screen sharing. So in 2007, I read a book called Bringing Nature Home by Douglas Tallamy. And if you haven't read anything by Douglas Tallamy, I urge you to go out and buy all his books from Politics and Prose, which is a local bookstore. In it, Professor Tallamy argues that the fate of space for wildlife is not in our protected national parks, which are very widely spread out across the country and also are heavily regulated. The space for wildlife is at home, in our yards, on our highway median strips, in our parking lots, and city parkland. He has published 2 other books since then, The Living Landscape, which is an excellent resource for not only what plants are native to certain areas, but which ones have the greatest wildlife value, because not all plants are equal. I'll give you a hint. Oak trees win pretty much all the time. In 2019, he published Nature's Best Hope, which makes the unassailable case that without a paradigm shift in how we use private land, the decline of wildlife from insects to birds to amphibians and mammals will continue. But if we convert even half of our lawns, 20,000 acres in the United States out of 40,000 that are now lawn, we can create contiguous swaths of acreage that can be utilized by wildlife. Simply put, our native plants support our native insects and bird species, and both of those have experienced significant declines in recent years. Many insects require specific plants to complete their life cycle, and those plants are those that are native to the region the insects live in or migrate through, not ones that came from Asia. Even though a butterfly might suck the nectar out of a plant from Asia, it does not breed on that plant. The caterpillars won't eat it. And if you think about it, think about monarch butterflies, because everybody who doesn't love a monarch. So this photograph was taken at my pollinator garden in my home in Ontario, Canada, where I live for about 3 months out of the year, when I can still get to it because it's not snowed in, where I have just created a pollinator garden. And you can see there's a little caterpillar there that is going to, form a chrysalis and make more monarchs. And this area is about the end point of the northern migration. But monarch caterpillars only eat milkweed. That's it. They don't eat other things. So if milkweed isn't available, except for in these widely disparate and separated pockets, they're not going to survive. And we know that their numbers are being decimated. So now imagine that milkweed is planted in continuous swaths of what was lawn, across the migration path. Doug Tallamy has turned this concept into a movement called Homegrown National Park. And you can type in homegrownnationalpark.org. And if you have a garden that you've taken lawn out of and turned into a native garden, you can put a little pin there and you'll be part of his Homegrown National Park. So I've been able to take what I've learned from these books and other resources in my training as a master gardener. And let me just make clear, master gardener is a terrible name because I just love to play in the dirt. I don't have a PhD in gardening. I just do a lot of it. And I take a course and I have to do continuing ed. So I speak at garden clubs as a master gardener, and I staff plant clinics. At the synagogue, I renovated what was a very overgrown, outdated, and partly invasive planting in the front of the synagogue. And we did that with primarily volunteers. We did have to hire somebody to take out some of the bigger plants. Currently, we're renovating a weed and invasive plant choked rain garden. And a couple of weeks ago, our Tikkun Olam committee hosted a Havdalah service with showing Doug Tallamy's video, Nature's Best Hope, and it's on YouTube. So if you want to listen to it, I highly recommend it. Several of the attendees have already called me, and we're going to work together I'll show them how to remove their lawn safely and plant native species. And then my neighborhood, I also got in touch with Doug Tallamy, and he did a Zoom with our neighborhood. So I guess you can tell I really like Doug Tallamy. But by far, the most joy and possibly the most impactful is leading by example. So this is my yard when we moved into the house. I live on a corner lot across from a school. It's very visible. It gets a lot of foot traffic. So this was we moved in as retirees. We have a much smaller house and a half an acre of land. You can tell I have a thing about overgrown non-native gardens, but this garden had invasive stiltgrass, it had porcelainberry, it had tons of English ivy. This plant right here is called autumn olive. It is wildly invasive, and deer, which, what are you going to do? There's lots of deer. So over 7 years, we've removed close to half the lawn, both in the front and in the back, and planted it with a woodland garden. We were very lucky in that we had 3 very large pin oak trees, plus a willow oak already on the property. But I did take advantage of both rainscapes, and if you're thinking of putting in a garden where you're taking out lawn or you're reducing the flow of water into the street, please get in touch with Rainscapes. If somebody wants to put that in the chat, it's rainscapes.org. Also, Tree Montgomery. Montgomery County will give you free trees. And they're big trees. I've got 2 beech trees and a bald cypress from Tree Montgomery. So Rainscapes does require a certain percentage, I think it's 75% by biomass of the plants that you put in your garden. And but I was able to do that. So I have a Rainscape sign out front. So anybody who walks by my house knows it's a Rainscapes garden. It's a certified Baywise landscape. So I have that sign out front. And then I also have a sign that explains why I don't rake the leaves, because I leave the leaves and I leave the stalks until the overwintering critters leave in the spring. So this is what it looked like sort of as we were getting started. I experimented a lot with getting rid of lawn. I saved up every bit of cardboard I could find and laid it out and put mulch over it. And then I let it sit there for 6 months. I did this in March and we didn't plant until October. When we went to pull it up, the cardboard was gone. I did make sure all the plastic was off before I did this, so I didn't have to deal with that. We tilled it in and then we started planting. So this is, whoops, sorry. I don't know how to go back actually. Let me see. So this is what the yard looks like now, but this was just about a year old. And here's some other views. Here's lawn, here's garden. The garden does have a path through it, so I'm hoping that neighbors will come and walk through it. I am not adverse to using some non-native plants. And I think here's where we get into the discussion of what's okay and what's not okay. Invasive plants are not okay, but there are many plants that are non-native, but don't hurt anybody. And if you want a ginkgo tree in your yard, plant a ginkgo tree, just plant a bunch of natives around it. It's okay. And in fact, if I have time, I'm going to run through real quick some of my favorite plants. This is a non-native plant, but it's really cute. It's called an Edgeworthia chrysantha. And what I look for in just about any plant is, does it have more than one season of value? So this is 4-season value. This is the winter. The winter is here, the summer, the fall. And then in February, this is what it looks like right now. But these are native ground covers and other perennials, Amsonia, Pycnathema muticum, mountain mint. There's several different kinds. They're tall. They are bee magnets. They just love them. And they will take over a site. So if you need to fill in an area, that's the way to do it. And then butterfly weed is another aggressive native plant. Non-native plants tend to be very aggressive, but there are very aggressive native plants as well. And the mountain mint and the butterfly weed are 2 of those. Agastache, penstemon, and monarda. Monarda is also bee balm, and you can make tea out of it. These are some ground covers that I use quite a bit. Blue-eyed grass down at the bottom here. This is a native. It's just gorgeous in the spring. This is a non-native, non-invasive, but it'll fill in. And one of my goals is to not have any bare ground and not have to use mulch. Mulch is not the most environmentally friendly stuff. Has its place, but the less the better. Geranium maculatum will spread like crazy. It'll come up in places you just had no idea it could come up. The same thing with this Pulmonian reptans, Stairway to Heaven. Tiarella is probably one of my favorites. It's semi-evergreen. In the spring, you get these beautiful flowers here, and they mass. So you'll see them, throughout the forest floor. Most of these are semi-shade plants because I have a woodland garden. Green and gold. And this lobelia is a blue cardinal flower. It's one of the better blue flowers you can get in the shade, but my God, I had master gardeners coming over and digging it out because they wanted some and I had way too much. It spreads like crazy. Heuchera is a very sturdy native plant, and phlox, any of the kinds of phloxes and irises. The iris cristata is a good early pollinator. And that's the other thing you want to think about, is that when is this plant going to be used? The white wood aster, that's a good pollinator for the fall. Don't forget your ferns. There's tons of native ferns, and they're all wonderful. And they don't have a lot of wildlife value in terms of caterpillars eating them, but they're really great for things to hide under, like caterpillars. I don't mean like rats or snakes or anything. The spring ephemerals are wonderful for the early pollinating bees, like Virginia bluebells and Dutchman's breeches and trout lilies. And bleeding heart isn't a native, but it's awful pretty. Some of the shrubs that I love, Fothergilla is a native. I like it because it's got a beautiful habit and it's got spectacular fall color. The bottlebrush buckeye will get huge. It has these massive plumes. I have seen all kinds of birds, all kinds of butterflies, and I'll show you in a minute my favorite new bug, which I had never seen before. It's a very big plant. My only complaint is that deer actually kind of like it, so you have to spray. So this right here is a hummingbird moth on my bottlebrush buckeye. I've only seen it once and I never saw it again. But it's a great plant. It goes very well in a large space like a synagogue area, especially if it's fenced so deer can't get to it. Northern bayberry and viburnums, these have very high wildlife value, mostly because of the berries. And this was something I saw in the Lost Gardens at Helligan in Cornwall, UK, and I just couldn't resist.
Thank you so much.
So I had one other thing, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I wish I could say that I had a plan like Linda. I really don't. I love teaching about gardening. I love spreading the word about native gardening. If my garden inspires one person and the work at the temple inspires one person and my Master Gardener talks inspire one person, that's 3 people who are going to go out and tell their friends. And if I inspire one person tonight, that'll be 4. So I don't have a plan. I just have a garden.
Thank you so much, Betsy. It's wonderful and inspiring to see that this is not something that happens overnight. It's something that you can go in with a plan or not, but it can take time. It can be a season, it can be years, it can be a decade, as we're going to hear shortly from Bethel Hebrew congregation in terms of their effort to combat invasives in their community around their congregation. And again, we can all move at our own timeline. It's so exciting to see all of the different resources that are coming through the chat, because what I hope that people walk away from tonight thinking is that there are so many different ways to begin this work, or if you're already doing it, to deepen it, to take it in another new and exciting direction. So thank you so much for your example. I wanted to just raise up one question, which I'll also ask Kit a little bit later, but some people have wondered, how do you consult with, or how do you consult congregations that are looking to install native plant gardens, but are maybe having some issues with landscapers who are removing things too aggressively, or don't know how to work with these kinds of new gardens?
Wow, that's even I have to say that I trim my plants very high up so that when they come back, I know not to pull them out. I've done that. So it's a matter of education. That's a tough one. I think obviously shrubs are going to be easier. The perennials, I would not let a landscaper touch them until the perennials are up enough so that they look like a plant that's supposed to be there. You can take pictures of what some of the early weeds are, like winter creeper, chickweed, hairy bittercress. Those are things that are very obvious, and you can show them the picture and you say, pull this and don't pull anything else. But that's a problem, not just in synagogues.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's a good question. I wish I had a better answer.
Well, it sounds like one of the solutions is just education, right? It's changing how we all think about these natural spaces. And that takes time. And it takes events like these and so many other conversations that are happening across our different communities. One other thing that I just wanted to lift up, I know you created a really useful list that I put in the chat a little bit earlier that has a bunch of different resources. And so I'm going to put that in the chat again for people if they want to take a look. Could you just put in the chat your email address if you're willing, if people have questions and they can reach out to you directly. I know there are also some questions about where to source some of these native plants, what kind of funding opportunities are available.
Absolutely. And I know one person asked if there was any master gardeners who spoke at synagogues. And tonight I am not speaking as a master gardener because I didn't have time to get this approved. So everything I say is just Betsy Kingery, not master gardener Betsy Kingery, but I do speaking at different places. But let me go ahead and put that in the chat. And thank you so much for this program. I'm just thrilled. I was thrilled to be asked to participate, and I just love what I'm hearing. It's wonderful.
Thank you. So we talked a lot about the native plant gardens. We talked about thinking about how we reclaim our lawns. The other side of it is removing invasive species that have spread out across our communities. And so I would love to turn it over in a moment to Nancy and Stuart Davis of Beth Hebrew Congregation in Alexandria, who will share their work with us in that area. And then we'll hear a little bit from Kit Gage at Temple Sinai about some of the other projects that their green group is engaged in, so we can really walk away from today knowing about the full diversity of efforts that we can engage in, and how we can actually get our communities, our synagogue boards, our temple leadership to buy in to these amazing endeavors. So Nancy and Stuart, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Are you unmuted?
Yeah. So, okay, can everybody see the slides? Great. Well, good evening, everybody. And Nancy and I are and thank you for inviting us. We've really gotten a lot out of the presentation so far, and there's a lot to copy in the chat, follow up on. So I'm going to talk about our experiences at Beth Hebrew Congregation. It's the oldest synagogue in Northern Virginia. We started in Old Town Alexandria back in 1859, and we moved to a 5.5-acre campus in 1957 with a 2-acre forest. We have 600 families, and there are many religious services as well as social, educational, and service activities. We have a full-time preschool, and we have a religious school that meets twice a week. So this was back in 2002. We had this property for 45 years, and nobody ever went back there. Nobody even thought about going back there. So 45 years, we had an unmanaged oak hickory forest. It was totally covered with invasives. In 2002, the Brotherhood sponsored an initiative to restore the woods in honor of retiring Rabbi Arnold Fink. Congregants and Boy Scouts built trellises, paths, procured benches, a picnic table, and built an ark for the Torah with stones from Israel. And there was an Eagle Scout project to build a bridge across the West Ravine, which is heavily used by the preschool now. So even as late as 2015, that we still had this, just overgrown English ivy was probably the worst invasive species. We faced major challenges. We had neglected maintenance, over almost 30 species of invasives. We had erosion, rapid stormwater runoff, trash, trees that needed attention. And we needed to build trust to the leadership of the congregation. At first, we were not even allowed to plant trees without the congregational board approving of it. And we mainly just pulled ivy and other invasives, and we had a very limited budget back then. But we've been striving to engage Bethel in environmental preservation. So what we learned in this effort was environmental preservation is just one of the social justice missions of a religious congregation. Primary goal of any conservation project needs to align with the congregation's mission so we can get buy-in and participation. Therefore, we talked about improving the environment through spirituality, education, community building, and tikkun olam. We have many competing interests. We have a huge board of directors with endless meetings. Many subgroups become fiefdoms. Many pots of money, healthy competition for resources, including volunteers. So decisions were fragmented, but we came to a conclusion over two truths. Out of chaos, there's opportunity for leadership. And if you bring in grants and dedicated donations, you are more likely to gain approval for your activities. So we have positive forces that have helped us. We have volunteers that attend monthly work days. We have a contract with a landscaper. We have the support of a religious school all the way from preschool to 7th grade. And we have the support of the Alexandria City Natural Resource Manager, the cooperative extension agent, the state forester, tree stewards, master gardeners, and the landscaping professional. So we've been building communities. And we build communities through outreach activities that include monthly work days for adults announced via a separate listserv. We teach environmental science in the religious school classrooms, as well as during the work days for the kids. We have articles in the Bethel newsletters and a synagogue-wide listserv and dedicated page on the synagogue's website, something we need to give more attention to. We involve families, and we've done that in family environmental days, which coincides pretty much with Earth Day. So
in March 2018, we had a watershed moment when a car chassis was pulled onto a tow truck and wheeled away from the synagogue. That car chassis was originally completely hidden by vines in the West Ravine. And at that time, we realized that the forest was no longer seen by either the synagogue or the neighbors that surround the property as just a dumping place for their garbage. We cleared invasives with the help of the volunteers, with the landscaper, and with a company called Invasive Plant Control, Inc. This was also around 218. The city biologist recommended that we have the woods treated by this company to give us a leg up on the invasives. And we made a presentation to the board and won approval. IPC is used by the city of Alexandria as well as Fairfax and Arlington counties. Its workers do not use Roundup, but they do use other herbicides that kill the leaves and stems of the invasive plants and send the chemical down to the roots without disturbing the soil and causing further erosion. This is a huge benefit in our forest because erosion is such a problem.
In addition to that, we've created test gardens with the help of native plants with the help of funding from the state forestry grant. We've removed hazards and trash. We've planted a wildflower garden through an Audubon Society grant. We received a soil and water conservation grant. With the help of that, congregational funds, volunteer labor, we've terraced the West Ravine and created step pools to slow the speed of the stormwater runoff. And we planted vegetation in and on the sides of the ravine. So work continues and the never-ending job of removing invasives.
Removing the invasives is important, but it's only half the battle. As soon as the land is cleared, you have to replant it to prevent the invasives from growing back. There are no clear definitions of what an invasive plant is, or a weed for that matter. Experienced gardeners say there are only plants that are in the wrong places. We consider an invasive any plant that does not feed or shelter local insects, animals, or birds. We also remove plants that grow so prolific that they steal nourishment from native species. Hence, in addition to official invasives, we have problem plants, or we call them problem plants, such as wild strawberries and some of the knotweeds. There are many issues related to specific species. And some examples might include the fact that we have lovely grapevines in our forest, and they're extremely difficult to distinguish from porcelainberry vines, which are invasive. We use two kinds of software to help us with plant identification, and neither are perfect. Greenbrier, at the same time, is not considered invasive. It is a native plant whose berries feed birds in the winter, but it climbs on and kills trees, so we spend a lot of time cutting it back. Poison ivy is also considered a native plant, and it feeds birds, but we have kids in the forest daily, so we have to be selective as to where we leave it and let it grow.
I forgot to mention back under accomplishment, we recently received 40% off of our City of Alexandria stormwater fee because of the conservation landscaping we've completed, and by identifying over 50 mature trees of having a caliber of 10 inches or more.
Our forest continues to surprise and delight. It's now a sacred space, a place for religious services and music, enhanced tree canopy, shelter and food for wildlife, solitude for meditation and relaxation, a natural children's playground, teaching about the environment, gardening, picnics, beauty, community. Thank you.
And here is a picture of our late Rabbi Arnold Fig, who inspired all this.
You want to take?
Wow, Nancy, Stuart, thank you so much for sharing all of these incredible photos, the resources, the just the story of your community coming together. One of the things that really stands out to me is this idea of it being a community project. It's not just the green team operating separately. It's essential to the identity of your congregation. And it sounds like it's something that you've really built over time. You know, that just in the way that roots take time to spread, to deepen, you've done that. And it becomes a way to gather everyone. I'm just so excited to, I live in Northern Virginia. I'd love to visit the community at some time to
Let us know. You're welcome.
Yeah, we have our next work day at 10 a.m. on Sunday, March 12th, and all are welcome. We'll give you a tour.
Thank you. I'm sure there will be some other people on the call who will join you and join us together. So I'm seeing a few different questions in the chat. I'd love to spend just a few moments to share some of these questions with you. And then I'd like to also invite Gage from Temple Sinai to talk a little bit about how they are starting up some projects. You know, what it's like to be at the beginning of this process, to really be seeding the earth for these kind of endeavors. So I'm seeing questions from Elizabeth Berry wanted to know what landscaper you use for maintenance. That's the first question. And Andrew wanted to know where you started, like how you began.
Let's see. So it was a Brotherhood initiative, and a Brotherhood member who was also a landscaper took the lead on it for many years, I'd say until 2006 or even after that. And then
he moved to California,
right,
to
and
the desert.
the head of our Chapel in the Woods committee is a lawyer, and he
And a birder.
yeah. And he took it over and recruited a handful of people who many of whom continue to take responsibility for it, but it's still a Brotherhood project. Yeah.
And what landscaper do you use?
Oh, we've used several, but I'm very happy with the current one. It's QUET Quetzal. It's based here in Arlington, and the head of the company is Victor Lopez, and he's really knowledgeable about native plants. The congregation uses a different landscaper, and some of the problems previously expressed are plague the rest of the congregation, but we had worked together with Quetzal quite well.
The other landscaper gave us some real angst with their freewheeling pruning exercises that kind of destroyed a few plants.
Right. The another I think we mentioned the landscape designer earlier in the presentation, and her name is Geraldine Levy, and she is a member of a different congregation, but
Oseh Shalom.
and she has been very generous volunteering her time at Bethel.
That's great. Thank you. And I do know that Temple Road of Shalom also has a lot of great invasive work. And so if people are interested in being in touch with them, please feel free to reach out to me. And of course, if you have questions for Nancy and Stuart beyond our limited time together, feel free to reach out to me at jcan@ipldmv.org. I'll put it in the chat so everyone can see. Oh, hi, Joan. It's great to see you. Thank you for being with us tonight. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to Kit. What were some of the buzzwords that you used to get the buy-in that you needed from the board leadership? I know you were talking a little bit about coming with grants, coming with money, right? So that was helpful. But what else really got people to move?
One thing was persistence, because might have to spend several emails over a period of several months to, and we've kind of a great people. We have a Chapel in the Woods committee, and it's including a former president and a couple of board members, and I think that's helped. And when the rabbi, our current rabbi and current executive director came, we made sure to give them tours and explain what's going on, what our needs are.
That's great. Thank you. And I know it was also a way to honor, right, your past clergy as well. I think about some of the ways that we honor those who've passed in our tradition, and we often have yard set lights. We might dedicate a pew. We might think about a wall or a building, but a way to really honor members of our community by giving back to the natural world is a really beautiful gesture, and feels like an opportunity for a lot of different congregations to think about how they lift up members of the community.
I thought what a great moment was visiting Rabbi Fink's son, Daniel, who's like 11th generation rabbi in Boise, Idaho. And they have a huge garden where they grow food for the homeless.
Thank you for sharing. Nancy and Stuart, it's such a pleasure to hear this story. It's so inspiring. And I can't wait to visit the Chapel in the Woods. I'd love to spend the last bit of our call turning the floor over to Kit Gage at Temple Sinai to talk a little bit about their pollinators efforts and their tree planting efforts. I know that these in some ways are some new projects and some ongoing projects, and it would be great to hear from you as well. How are you finding community partnerships? How are you getting buy-in from your congregation, from the board, as you begin some of these efforts?
Hi all, it's great to see you. I know some of you already, and I've worked with some of you already, and I just wanted to mention Liz Feldman is co-chair of the Green Team for Temple Sinai now, which is great. We have young blood. In some ways, Temple Sinai our green efforts are long and ongoing, and in some ways, some of them are very new. So, but the ongoing ones have turned out to be really interesting. We got board buy-in probably more than 5 years ago to do an evaluation of the entire grounds. Now, Temple Sinai, unlike Oseh Shalom and Bethel, is much smaller, much more constrained, and mostly wooded. What is not completely impervious is kind of, you can't call it a forest because the trees are too damaged, but it's functionally forest. So it's a really different kind of situation, and because of that, there aren't so many invasive plants that we're dealing with. But we wanted to save the forest, especially in the back, and so we came out with we hired a landscape company, well respected, and they did a great plan, and then it kind of sat on the shelf because the temple decided to do an addition. The good news was they were able to use that plan that we came out with that had a rain garden and planting some more trees and it wasn't exactly a chapel, but some reposing spaces for the congregants maybe to meet. And so that's going to get incorporated as the required stormwater mitigation as a result of the addition. So it's kind of funny, but it's great that that was there, because we had a we were able to put that vision into that project. We've also over the years had stormwater programs for the congregation, and we just had a fabulous environmental equity seminar. Maybe some of you were able to see that. We reached out to a lot of congregations. So there's two things we're doing right now. One of them is, as I said, the forest is in pretty bad shape, but there wasn't a policy of replacing trees when they died. And that's a big, that's a really big deal. And so we're now two trees died very recently, and the congregation paid to have them removed. And we convinced the rabbis and the board to replace them. And we selected some trees, and they've been purchased and they've been planted and they look gorgeous. And we're trying to evolve that into a policy, because you don't necessarily think of doing that all the time, but if it becomes a policy, then you just do it, and it's kind of becomes part of the thinking of what you do. And the other thing we're doing is we're planting really in about the only place you can, in the only sunny place you can, very visibly. We're planting a native pollinator garden, and we're starting out pretty small. It's going to just be about 12 by 8 feet, but very visible, all native plants. What we prepared it like 2 or 3 months ago is what we jokingly call a lasagna garden, but you heard a description of that before. Basically, you put down cardboard and then mulch on top, which helps to give a little more organics to the ground and prepares the soil, makes the soil a little bit easier to work with. And so in the spring, we will be planting our beginning pollinator garden. We're working with the green team. There's a couple of youth groups. One of them is I think right now probably working on the signage for the pollinator garden, so that people know what it is they're looking at. It's just not a bunch of ivy or pachysandra or something. It's actually an intentional thing that's intended to attract pollinators. I think that, so in the spring that should be up and going, and the green team will work to do maintenance on it. And we will also make sure that, as I put up in the chat too, that the landscapers know that this is not weeds, because it is a huge thing. I know, poor Naomi Edelson, who founded Sacred Grounds, her temple, they had this big old rain garden, and that whole thing got mowed like twice. The first time it recovered, and then the second time it was 86. So, I mean, even the most intentional people can get messed up by landscapers or mow and blow people who just they're not trained to identify any of this. You can't blame them for doing that unless you train them and make sure that, anybody that they work with will also know that you're not, this area, don't touch it, or if you're going to touch it, get very careful instructions on what you're supposed to do. I have worked, I don't know if since the beginning, but almost since the beginning with Sacred Grounds, because I've got some native plant expertise and stormwater expertise. So it's in answer to some, an earlier question, I've been able to help Temple Sinai because I've got that background, and but there are a lot of really interested people in Temple Sinai to do this kind of work, and so it hasn't been too much of a complexity to get buy-in from the temple, including from the rabbis.
Could you speak a little bit about this amazing idea of replanting trees and some of the resources that you used to determine which trees you wanted to plant, and how you supported that effort physically, financially at the congregation?
Well, I picked out the trees and then I said, I want these trees, and people said, sure, fine. And it was also what was available we didn't do something like the equivalent of Tree Montgomery. It's in the district. And we wanted to put them in right away. But for example, Stadler's had a sale where they will deliver and plant trees, and I've worked with them before, and I recommend them to people who are want to plant something that's more than this tall. So I chose them, but I also chose them based on this being a visible area. I wanted trees that were going to be pretty in the spring and in the fall, and would work in a sort of a dappled, mostly sunny situation. But in terms of getting, I don't think we've got, I don't know that, I think Liz would probably agree. I don't think we've got Temple Sinai buy-in yet to replace every tree that goes with a new tree, but I've raised it, and we're pushing, and I think because we got the buy-in to do it this one time, that's the first step, I'd say, in getting this to be a policy. Now, because almost the entire rest of the grounds of Temple Sinai is going to be part of the renovation of that area, there will be a bunch of trees, some trees taken down that are dying, and a bunch of new ones planted. So this will not be, I don't anticipate we're going to have to replace, in the next 5 years, 10 dead trees, because that'll already have just happened. But inevitably you lose trees, and the sooner you can, if ideally what you do is plant a tree, if you see that there's a space that you want to fill in a slowly dying forest, plant those trees now, so that and I've done this in my own yard, plant the trees now so that when the bigger tree dies, it's not quite as sad. And if those trees are in the back of your congregation where nobody sees them, cut them as a snag. You all know what snags are? It's like a 20 to 25 foot trunk, and you leave that trunk of the dead tree for the woodpeckers to make their homes in. But I tried to do that in the front of Temple Sinai, and people laughed. So that didn't happen, but because not everybody understands why you would leave a snag in a very visible place. It's a step too far.
Sure. Well, one step forward at a time. We move at the speed of the congregation, but we have people like you, like Nancy, like Stuart, like Linda, like Betsy, who are leading the charge. And really helping us move from point A to point B, seeing for me, the before and after pictures from every congregation, from everyone who's spoken tonight is really, really inspiring, because you can actually see the change and how it happens. And we also sense that cultural evolution within each of the congregations that you're a part of. I'd love, as we wrap up, to just put a question in the chat for the group. We've learned a lot of information today at various different levels. And so I'd love to just ask us to consider, what's one green step in your own life or in your shul or in your synagogue that you'd like to take after tonight, whether you've been involved in native plant gardening and invasive species removal for a long time, and you want to participate in something more, or you're interested in getting started in one of these initiatives for the first time. What's a green step that you'd like to take? And a follow-up question is, what is a question that you might have for one of the speakers or for multiple speakers who joined us tonight? Because we'll assemble some of these questions. We'll make sure that they get to our guests tonight, so that they can respond to them, because I know there were lots of different questions. Just in closing, Kip, you were talking about this idea of planting trees, envisioning a tree, you seeing that it's dying and really thinking ahead to how you can fill it in. I'd love to just quickly share a teaching from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan was a first century sage who lived in Jerusalem during the destruction of the Second Temple. And Rabbi Yochanan taught, if you should be holding a sapling in your hand when they tell you that the Messiah has arrived, first you plant the sapling and then you go out and you greet the Messiah. And I really love this teaching because it imagines that the work that we do is not waiting for a magic solution for salvation for a Messiah. We plant looking ahead, looking to the future. We plant and we bring the Messiah, we bring whatever that means to us individually into fruition. Rabbi Yochanan was writing during a period of destruction of the Second Temple, and we're arguably in a moment of destruction of our sacred temple, our sacred world now, our planet. And I hope that we can hold this teaching close to our hearts, because there are things, as we learned today, big or small, in our gardens, in our sanctuaries, in our woodland areas, in our whole communities, that can make a tangible difference as we restore, as we rematriate the sacred land that we call home. So again, I want to thank all of our fantastic guest speakers, Linda Solomon of Oseh Shalom, Betsy Kingery of Temple Shalom, Nancy and Stuart Davis of Beth Hebrew Congregation, Gage, and Liz Feldman, who couldn't be here, of Temple Sinai. If you want to stay up to date on Jewish Climate Action Network's activism in the DMV and other learning opportunities, I invite you to join our Facebook group, where we frequently post about different events that both we're sponsoring and that other organizations in the community are sponsoring. And if you're interested in reaching out to us and being in communication in this larger conversation, to join our listserv, you can just send a blank email to JCAN-DMV. It's a Google group that we have. We're hoping to plan some more monthly regular gatherings as we launch our 5783 2023 Omer calendar, with weeks upon weeks of climate action that we can take together as a community as we move through the Omer from Passover to Shavuot. Again, I want to thank everyone so much for being so active in the chat, for asking amazing questions and sharing these resources. We are our best resources, our best allies, as we move through this really exciting moment of opportunity. As Nancy and Stuart said, challenges breed opportunities, opportunities for leadership. And it's clear that this community gathered together tonight is meeting that challenge. So thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful evening, a joyous start to the month of Adar, and early Chag Purim Sameach. And I look forward to seeing you all sometime very soon. Thank you. Have a good night.